Welcome to FlukyFacts, your go to channel for global economy and geopolitics, explained simply and clearly. I hope you are doing well. Today's topic is one that shapes the world economy, drives international diplomacy, and affects billions of people, including you, me, here in India. We are talking about the G7. What is it? Why does it exist? Who's in it? And most importantly, in a rapidly changing world where new powers are rising every single day, does the G7 still matter? By the end of this presentation, you will have a clear, complete answer. Let's get into it. Here's the question we need to start with. Every single year, without exception, the G7 summit dominates global news coverage, breaking news alerts, live TV coverage, headlines in every major newspaper on the planet. But why? What actually happens at the summit? What decisions are made behind those closed doors? And who does it really affect? Is it just a gathering of powerful politicians for photo opportunities, or in something genuinely important being decided that shapes your life, your economy, and your country's future? The answer is it's very real. And to understand why we need to go back 50 years to one of the most chaotic period in modern economic history. Picture the world in the early 1970s. Oil crisis, raging inflation, economic instability on a scale the modern world had never seen before. In 1973, Arab oil producing nations launched a devastating embargo against the West. Overnight, oil prices quadrupled. Inflation exploded, currencies collapsed, unemployment surged across Europe and North America. The world was fracturing. And here was the terrifying part. The major economies had absolutely no coordinated response. Every country was trying to save itself alone, and it wasn't working. Rising oil prices, collapsing currencies, unemployment surging across the West. These conditions set the stage for something new, something the world had never tried before, a new kind of global cooperation born out of crisis. And that's exactly what happened. In 1975, French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing brought together the leaders of the world's six largest economies at the Château du Tremblay near Paris. The United States, the United Kingdom, West Germany, Japan, France, and Italy gathered for the very first time as a coordinated group. That was the birth of the G6. Just 1 year later, in 1976, Canada joined, and the group of seven, the G7, was officially formed. Now, fast forward in 1998, Russia was invited to join, briefly expanding the group to the G8. But in 2014, after Russia's annexation of Crimea, it was expelled, and the group returned to its original seven. And today, 50 years after the first meeting in France, the G7 remains one of the most consequential forum in global politics. From a crisis response group in 1975 to a global leader in 2026. So, who exactly sits at this table? The United States, Canada representing North America, the United Kingdom and France representing Western Europe's two nuclear powers, Germany and Italy, the economic engines of continental Europe, and Japan, Asia's most advanced economy and the only Asian nation at the G7 table. Seven nations, all advanced democracies, all committed to open markets, the rule of law, and the rule based international order. Together, they represent a level of combined economic, diplomatic, and military influence that is simply unmatched anywhere else on earth. Now, here's the key question that a lot of people get wrong. These countries were not chosen because of their size, they were not chosen because of their population. China has 1.4 billion people, India has 1.476 billion people. Neither is in the G7. The selection was based on one thing and one thing only: economic power and global financial influence. When the G7 was formed in the 1970s, these seven nations collectively controlled the majority of the world GDPs. They dominated international trade, they set monetary policy for the entire Western world, they controlled investment flow that reached every corner of the globe. Economic influence, not population, not geography. Economic influence only. That's what got you a seat. Alright, so now we know who they are and why they were chosen. But what do they actually do? The G7 operates across five major pillars that together define its global influence. The first pillar is economy. The G7 coordinates global fiscal policy, manages inflation responses, and works to stabilize financial system worldwide. Remember the 2008 global financial crash. G7 coordination was central to preventing a complete worldwide economic collapse. The second pillar is trade. The G7 sets fair trade rules, work to reduce protectionist barriers, and shape the global framework for how countries buy and sell with each other. Third is security. The G7 addresses active conflicts around the world, imposes coordinated sanctions on rogue nations, and build collective defense and peace framework through aligned foreign policy. Fourth, and this is increasingly critical, is technology. The G7 is governing artificial intelligence, regulating digital markets, and establishing global cybersecurity standards. The rules they write today will shape the tech world for the next generation. And fifth is climate. G7 nations are driving net zero commitments, financing clean energy, transition in developing nations, and leading global climate finance pledges at every major international summit. Five pillars, one united mission: save the world. Now, let's look at what actually on the table right now. The 2026 G7 summit agenda. Four major themes dominated this year's summit. First, global economy and trade. G7 leaders are grappling with rising trade tension, tariff disputes between major powers, and urgent strategy to stabilize global supply chain. After COVID-19 exposed dangerous vulnerabilities in how the world trades, resilience has become the new priority. Second, Ukraine and Iran. These two ongoing conflicts dominated the security discussion. G7 nations are now coordinating sanctions packages, military aid for Ukraine, and diplomatic strategy around Iran's nuclear ambitions. The message from the G7: they are staying aligned. Third, artificial intelligence. This was a massive agenda item. How do you create governance frameworks for AI? What are the ethical standards? How do you harness the power of this technology while protecting democracy and preventing misuse? The G7 is trying to write these rules before it's too late. And fourth, debt and development. Dozens of developing nations are facing debt crises that threaten to destabilize entire region. G7 leaders pledged coordinated support through multilateral institutions to address this before it becomes a global crisis. Heavy agenda, real consequences for every country on earth. Now, here's something really worth of paying attention to. India is not a G7 member, but India keeps getting invited to the summit. And the reason why tells us everything about India's rising power in the world. Look at this clearly. India brings two things to the table that the G7 desperately needs. On India's side, we are now the third largest GDP in the world by purchasing power. We have 1.476 billion people, the world's largest population, and one of its fastest growing consumer markets. On the G7 side, they need India for three critical reasons. India controls key global trade routes connecting Asia, the Middle East, and the West. India is central to building tech supply chains that are independent of China, and India as a large democracy is essential to any strategy designed to balance and counter Chinese global influence. This is not charity. This is not an honor. India's invitation to the G7 is a recognition of raw strategic power. The G7 needs India as much as India benefits from being at the table. But now we have to ask the uncomfortable question. Does the G7 still represent the world as it actually exists today? The answer, when you look at the number, honestly, is increasingly no. The G7 was formed when these seven nations dominated global GDP. But the world has changed dramatically since 1975. Today, the G7 combined share of global GDP has fallen from around 70% at its peak to under 45% today, and it still declined. There is zero representation in G7 from Asia's largest economies, from Africa, from Latin America, or from the global south. And consider this: China, India, Brazil, Nigeria, and Indonesia alone represent over 3.5 billion people. That's nearly half the world's entire population. None of them have a permanent seat at the G7 table. No China, no India as a member, no Brazil, no Africa. The G7 was designed for a world that no longer exists. And that gap between the G7 membership and the actual global power landscape is growing every year. And that gap has opened the door for alternative forum to rise and challenge G7 dominance. First, the G7 itself. Seven wealthy democracies, high influence, coordinates global economy, trade, security, and climate policy. But limited membership, and that limitation is becoming a serious weakness. Second, BRICS. Originally, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now expanding, including more emerging economics. BRICS represent the nations that feel excluded from the Western dominated global order, and it's growing fast. Third, the G20. This is arguably the most important forum of our time. 20 major economies, including both G7 and BRICS members, it covers 85% of global GDP and 75% of world trade. Much broader, much more representative, and India hosted the G20 in 2023, one of the most significant moments in India's diplomatic history. And fourth, regional alliances such as ASEAN in Southeast Asia, the African Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These bodies are growing in influence and asserting their weight in trade, diplomacy, and regional security. The era of the G7 speaking alone for the world, that era is clearly over. But does that mean the G7 no longer matters? Absolutely not. Because despite all of the challenges, the G7 still punches far above its weight. And here's why. Economic power: G7 nations collectively hold enormous financial weight, over 40% of global GDP, and they use it to shape monetary policy, trade frameworks, and investment standard that the entire world follows. Finance: through their control over international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, G7 nations influence how money moves across the global economy. Their interest rate decisions ripple into every emerging market on earth, including India. Third, trade. G7 trade agreements and investment rule set the benchmark that other nations must align, with no access to the world's most valuable markets. Sanctions. This is perhaps the G7 most powerful tool. When these seven nations impose coordinated sanctions, as they did against Russia after 2022, the economic damage is enormous. No other group of nations has this level of financial coercive power. Technology. From AI regulation to semiconductor supply chains to data privacy, the G7 is writing the digital rule book for the next generation. And climate policy. G7 pledges at COP summits and G7 climate finance commitment shapes what the entire world does on carbon reduction and clean energy. Seven countries, enormous reach, still shaping the world every single day. Now, let's bring this home because this is where it gets personal for every Indian watching this video. G7 decisions affect India indirectly across four critical areas. First one is trade. G7 trade policies and tariff decisions directly shapes India's export opportunities, our access to key markets, and the bilateral trade agreements we are able to negotiate. When the G7 shifts its trade rule, India exporters feel it. Second, investment. G7 nations are India's largest foreign investors. When their interest rate rise, capital flows out of India. When their financial policy shift, FDI into India's is affected. Their economy shapes ours, whether we like it or not. Third is supply chain. The G7 push to reduce dependence on China and restore critical industries is creating massive new manufacturing and logistic opportunity for India. The China Plus One strategy that every G7 nation is pursuing. India is one of the biggest beneficiaries. And the final is tech partnership. G7 frameworks on AI, semiconductors, and digital trade define the rules India must navigate to access cutting edge technology and the world's most advanced tech markets. These rules affect India's IT sector, our startups, and our digital economy directly. The G7 is not a distant club for rich countries. Its decision lands in India, in our trade, our investment, our jobs, and our technology every single day. So, we have reached the final answer. The G7 is no longer only power center in the world. That much is clear. With the rise of BRICS, the growing influence of the G20, and emerging economies like India, China, and Brazil, reshaping the global order, power is shifting. But here's the truth, the G7 continues to shape finance, trade, technology, and international sanctions in ways that affect every nation on earth, member or not. Its collective decision still send the most powerful signals to global markets, governments, and institutions worldwide. Not the only voice, but still one of the loudest. The G7 is still influential. It's just no longer alone. Which brings us to the question that this entire video has been building toward. Should India join the G7? Think about it. India is now the world's third largest economy by purchasing power. We have the world's largest population. We are a democracy. We are a key strategic partner for every single G7 nation. We were invited to the 2026 summit. So, should India become a permanent member? Would that give India more influence over the global rules that affects us every day? Or is the G20, which is broader, more inclusive, and covers 85% of global GDP, actually the more important forum for India's long-term interests? Is India's power better exercised as a bridge between the global south and the west rather than as a member of an exclusive western-leaning club? These are genuinely fascinating questions and we want to hear your answer. Drop it in the comments below. Should India join the G7 or is the G20 more important today? Tell us what you think. If you found this video useful, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and reach more people. Subscribe to FlukyFacts so you never miss our next deep dive into global economy and geopolitics. Thanks for watching and I will see you in the next one.